The Start to Finish Reloading series is brought to you by epintegrations, home of the EP 2.0 brass annealer. They can anneal from 300 blackout to 50 BMG and everything in between while having to add or remove any parts, and can adjust in less than 30 seconds from cartridge to cartridge. Also, the home of the epintegrations lockdown reloading block, the last reloading tray you will ever need. And it's fully adjustable, just under 223 and just over 375 shy tack, and it can adjust in less than 1 second. For further information, check out the description box below for www.epintegrations.com. Enough said, let's get this going. So welcome to part 4 of the epintegrations Start to Finish Reloading series. And in this part, we're just going to finish up with brass prep and getting those primers seated. Let's get this going. Now, before you proceed, I can't stress this enough, is to make sure that your brass is completely dry. Before you finish your brass prep and you drop that powder and seat those primers, you got to make sure that there's not a lick of water in those casings. And a quick way to test for that is just to do something like this on the palm of your hand. If you see any beads of water, stop, get this back into the dehydrator and make sure that that brass is completely dry. So we are finally up to trimming brass. Now, why do we trim brass? Obviously, if your brass is longer than what your chamber can fit, you're going to end up damaging your rifle's chamber. So this is absolutely crucial that you get your brass trimmed. Now, brass will grow in length, especially if you excessively bump that shoulder back or move that shoulder back in regards to how much it's fire formed from. So, for example, in this reloading series, keep in mind, this was not fired out of my particular firearms chamber. This is fired out of most likely military grade firearm that had an excessive headspace. And we had to excessively bump back this headspace, datum line or shoulder, whatever you want to call it, damn near 0.010 of an inch. And I guarantee you, when that happens, that the length of the overall brass casing will grow. That brass needs to go somewhere. When you run this brass through a resizing die and you squeeze down the width of the body of the brass into spec, and we're also bumping that shoulder back to our desired headspace from fire form, especially if you're excessively oversizing that brass. For example, in this case, once fired brass that was fired out of a different firearms chamber, we had to excessively bump this back. Or if you're not truly using bump gauges and you're just taking your resizing die until it touches the shell plate and giving it a quarter turn, and you don't truly know what you're bumping your headspace back, or if you're continuously reloading for a case gauge and not your firearms chamber by not using bump gauges and using case gauges, and you're excessively bumping that shoulder back 0.010 of an inch every single time you resize it, that brass needs to flow somewhere. It just cannot disappear. And what will happen is the width of the brass will get put back into spec. You push that shoulder back, which pushes the overall amount of brass through the die itself, and the length of the casing will grow. And if it grows further or longer than what the maximum case length of that particular cartridge is, you will damage your firearms chamber. And what can happen is if you're excessively bumping the headspace back continuously because you're not using bump gauges, you're guessing by using a case gauge or just screwing that full length resizing die down until it touches the shell plate and just totally guessing on how much you are full length resizing your brass, what will happen is that brass will continue to grow. You will trim it off and you will fire form it or fire it and resize it again and excessively bump back the headspace. That brass will continue to grow and you trim it off again. And what will happen is the walls of the brass casing will get thin. That brass has to flow somewhere. You're cutting it off by trimming it, and the walls of that casing will get thinner and thinner to the point where you get case head separation. And that's why I highly recommend reloading for your rifle's chamber, not using a case gauge, using bump gauges so you know what you're dealing with, and not excessively oversizing that brass and excessively trimming off that brass every time you reload. So enough of beating a dead horse, but that's what will happen if you don't do these steps properly. Now, at least for 223 Remington, they show in the Hornady reloading manual here a maximum case length of 1.760. Most reloading manuals and rule of thumb is usually trim back from maximum case length 0.010 of an inch. So if they got a maximum case length of 1.760, you're going to trim back from that to 1.750. And I usually don't go to the absolute minimum of their recommended case trim length of 1.750. I might go a little over that, maybe 1.752, maybe 1.753, somewhere around there. But if you're absolutely new to the game, you're just starting out, it might not hurt just to go right to recommended case trim length. In this example, at least 223 Remington, it's 1.750. You know, if we were doing something like 308 Winchester, for pure example's sake, maximum case length is 2.015, and 0.010 of an inch back from that obviously is 2.005. So they're recommending that you would trim back, at least for 308 Winchester, at 2.005 inches. Well, keep in mind when you've been watching this reloading series that we had to bump back this excessive headspace. Remember that this brass was not fired out of my particular firearms chamber. It was out of a military grade firearm that had an excessive headspace. And we had to bump that back damn near 0.010 of an inch. It was quite excessive. Now, because of that, that brass has to flow somewhere, and that's going to increase the overall length of the brass. And I have yet to measure this. Matter of fact, I'm just going to grab some miscellaneous piece out of here, and I'm going to guarantee that's probably well over 1.760 because we had to bump back that headspace excessively. And sure enough, 1.7660. Let's try another one here. Well north of 1.760. And this one's a 1.764. Good chance if I was to not trim this brass and reload it and insert it into my firearms chamber, it would most likely damage that chamber, and that's not good. So you can see all these are going to have to get trimmed, and they're excessively long. We're going to have to trim damn near 0.015 of an inch off of that pure example right there. So I'll grab one more just for shits and giggles. 1.764. So that's what can happen if you're not using bump gauges. You're totally guessing of how much you are resizing that brass by using case gauges, or just screwing down that full-length resizing die and giving it a quarter turn. That's definitely what can happen. So keep that in mind. Now, I use the world's finest trimmer that you chuck up into a drill, and they're okay. They're inexpensive. I guess if I was to give you a recommendation, don't trim brass by hand. Trust me, you will get arthritis. You're going to hate it. Use some type of mechanical drill or something else I'm about to show you here in a little bit. Now, the world's finest trimmer, it's great and all, and they actually have the world's finest trimmer 1, and they also have the world's finest trimmer 2. Now, this is the world's finest trimmer 1 that's dedicated for specifically 223. I cannot change the insert or the body. It's dedicated for 223, but they do have the world's finest trimmer 2, which they came out with a few years ago, that has a body and different inserts that you can put into the main body itself. If you want to switch from, say, something like 223 to 243 or 223 up to 308, you can remove these inserts and put in the correct insert of the cartridge that you're trimming. You know, these are pretty inexpensive. I would say they're roughly about $60 to $70, depending on which one you get. And they're fine and all, and I still use them as of today. But the problem is with this is they only trim. That's all they do. They don't chamfer. They don't deburr. You know, I'm about to show that to you here in a little bit. You know, and what happens with the world's finest trimmer is it will trim this off and will put a very, very harsh cut on the case mouth opening. And you're about to see that here in a little bit. And then I need to follow up with that on my Lyman Case Prep Center in regards to removing that harsh cut of chamfering the outside of the case mouth opening, chamfering the inside of the case mouth opening. And it can just be tedious, and it's just more steps to the reloading process. So like I said before, and I'll say this again, buy the best equipment that you can afford at the time. And if I was to give you a recommendation, is to not buy the world's finest trimmer, but at least get something like the Groud Tri-Way trimmer. And what's nice about the Groud Tri-Way trimmer is not only does it trim, but it also chamfers and deburrs the inside of the case mouth opening. You're about to see that here in a little bit of why we do this. And it does 3 steps in one process, hence the name Tri-Way trimmer. It trims off the casing and also chamfers and deburrs the inside of the case mouth opening, saving you 2 steps, less time in the reloading room. But rather than roughly $60, $70 in comparison to the world's finest trimmer, these are roughly about $100 a piece, and they're dedicated for just one casing. You have to, if you are reloading for 243 and 308, you'll have to get 2 more of these at roughly $100 a crack. You know, if you want to step it up from there even more, is you can get what's called the Groud benchtop power trimmer. You know, it's probably one of the most premium trimmers in regards to trimming the brass, but it also chamfers and deburrs at the same time. 3 steps in one process. But this is very, very expensive. They don't exactly give this thing away. It can be very, very pricey. And there's also different inserts that you have to buy above and beyond this unit for depending on what casing you are trimming, chamfering, and deburring for. You know, if you want the best of the best, that would probably be the Henderson Precision trimmer, which is an amazing trimmer, but just the body itself is $440. You know, you can buy this with the motor attached above and beyond just the trimmer itself, and that raises the price to $780 just for trimming brass. But this also chamfers and deburrs, 3 steps all in one, just like the Groud. So, you know, if you want the cream of the crop, I would probably suggest looking at the Henderson Precision trimmer or the Groud benchtop or Tri-Way trimmers. Those 3. Take my advice, you do not want to do this by hand. Now, when it comes to the world's finest trimmer or the Groud Tri-Way trimmer, keep in mind that these particular trimmers work off the headspace of the brass. It doesn't come off the base of the brass. These ride off a particular collar on the inside of the trimmer that rides on the datum line or the headspace. Now, keep in mind that if your headspace bumps or headspace measurements when you fully resized your brass, if they're all over the place, your trim lengths will also be all over the place because you did not consistently full length resize your brass. And what can happen is if you don't consistently resize your brass and now your trim lengths are all not consistent because of it, is one piece of brass will be longer than the next. And the one piece of brass that has a longer neck on it because you didn't consistently bump your headspace it'll have a longer neck, more brass, has a better ability to bite down on that bullet, hence more neck tension. And because that one piece has more neck tension in comparison to the one before it, that will develop more pressure into the casing, higher velocities, and that bullet will impact paper higher in comparison to the other 4 shots of your 5-shot group, destroying your group. It's one of those things where if one fails, they all fail. So it's really important to make sure that you get consistent headspace bumps, to get consistent trim lengths, and get consistent trim lengths for consistent neck tension. If one fails, they all fail. So keep that in the back of your mind. Now, I do have this set up to be a little over what they recommended. Remember, out of the Hornady manual was 1.7500. I have this set up for roughly 1.751, maybe 1.752. But just to show you here how this works is this puts a very, very harsh cut on the case mouth opening. So I'll have to run this on the Lyman Case Prep Center in regards to knocking off that very harsh cut. There's a matter of fact, there's a really sharp burr on here right now. And if I was to insert this into my firearms chamber, that burr will most likely damage, mar, scratch the inside of my rifle's chamber. And if you continuously do that over and over, it's not going to be good for your firearms chamber, trust me. So after this process of having a very harsh 90-degree cut on this, I'll have to run this on the Lyman Case Prep Center to chamfer the outside and inside of that case mouth open to knock off that burr. Also, like I said, I'll have to chamfer the inside of the case mouth opening, so when I seat that bullet, that it doesn't scrape or scratch or mar the copper jacket of my bullet when it's time to seat that new bullet. And it all comes into play. And like I said, there's 2 extra steps above and beyond just trimming with the world's finest trimmer. And that's where the Grout Tri-Way trimmer or their Henderson Precision trimmer not only trims, but also chamfers the burr in 1 step, saving you 2 steps in the reloading process, hence saving you time. But let's get this measured. And this was exactly 1.752. So let me measure this next piece here. And this one is very excessive, 1.768. So 1.751 and just 752. This next one here before I trim it is huge, 1.770. That would definitely damage my firearms chamber. I could just feel that resistance as it's trimming it off. Then the resistance lets off when I know it's done trimming. And right there, 1.751. So I'm not going to bore you the rest of these. They're all going to come up the same because I know for a fact that my full-length resizing headspace datum line measurements are all the same. Now, one quick note when it comes to trimming brass is to make sure you're absolutely wearing safety glasses. Trust me, one time I forgot to put on my safety glasses and I got a speck of this brass in my eye. It was not good. It scratched my eyeball. It took a while for it to heal. And to make sure you are absolutely wearing these safety glasses when trimming brass. Now the next step is removing the crimp. In order to insert a new primer into that primer pocket, you need to remove that distinctive rim perimeter around that crimp. Matter of fact, I'll splice in a picture here. It's a little bit better to see. On the left, it's crimped. On the right, I cut out the crimp in order to insert a new primer. It's absolutely crucial that you do this in regards to the reloading process, or you will never get a new primer in that primer pocket. And there's a couple ways to do this. I started out initially with the Dillon Super 600, and it's great and all, and it does work, but I found that rather than swaging, and that's what this does, it literally swages or moves the brass out of the way so you can insert in the new primer. I find it works best to just cut it out completely, and that's where I purchased the RCBS small and rifle primer cutters here. Matter of fact, I have the small rifle primer in here, being that I'm reloading for 223 or 556, and they also have a large rifle primer cutter on the RCBS cutters here. And I just recommend doing this in regards to removing the crimp. It just works better. It's more smooth. I have less hiccups in regards to inserting that new primer. So I personally like to cut out the crimp and then I uniform the primer pocket. So what I'll do is just to grab a new piece of brass here is to cut out the crimp completely. Make sure that you use your brush and wipe this off. Any little brass specks on here that you do not brush off and you go to the next piece, it might hinder this part of the cutter going fully into the primer pocket itself. So it's really important to make sure you brush off this cutter every time you use it. Usually get a Method Your Madness down, hold your brush in your left hand, cut with your right. Then right after this, I'll uniform the primer pocket. And same deal here, is make sure you brush this off after every use, just to make sure that that uniformer fully inserts into the primer pocket itself. So by doing so, we cut out the crimp, and we also uniform the primer pocket, so when that new primer seats, it seats just below flush. It's very important to make sure that that primer seats just below flush. It's not exactly flush, or obviously definitely sticking out past the casing. You can get what's called a slam fire, where if the primer is sticking out past the casing and that bolt head slams home with force, it can ignite that primer before the casing's fully inserted into the chamber, which is a bad day, trust me. So make sure that you are removing that crimp and uniforming your primer pocket. Now, if you want to go a step above and beyond, especially if you're doing something high-end like bench press rifle shooting or F-class shooting, I know some guys will uniform the flash hole. I personally, regardless if you are high-end or not high-end, my personal opinion, uniforming the flash hole does nothing in regards to accuracy. It's just my opinion. But if you want to do it, you can. It's just another step in the reloading process. So being that I use the world's finest trimmer and I have a very harsh cut to this case mouth opening, it is absolutely crucial that you do this next step, and that's chamfering the outside of the case mouth opening. And what this will do is knock off that burr on the outside of the case mouth opening. And what that does is it knocks off the burr on the outside of the case mouth opening, so when this inserts into your firearm's chamber, that it doesn't damage your rifle's chamber, it doesn't scratch it, it doesn't mar it. And the next step is chamfering the inside of the case mouth opening. You can see you can definitely overdo this. You don't want to weaken the case mouth opening, and that causes more split necks. What I like to do is just use my hand as a guide here. I rest it on the side of the Lyman Case Prep Center, and I just put a very nice chamfer on the inside of the case mouth opening. And that just puts a nice bevel in there. By doing so, that puts a very nice bevel on the inside of the case mouth opening here, you can see. So when that new bullet is inserted, that it doesn't scrape or mar or scratch off the copper jacket as that new bullet is seated. So now you can see that the rough, harsh cut on the outside is removed to protect the chamber, and the nice bevel on the inside of the case mouth opening that's nice and uniform will help protect that copper jacket. And there's one last final step, and that is just running it on the brush to remove all of those brass filings. And you are officially done with brass prep hell. Actually, I do have a quick note here before we move on. Thank God when it comes to removing the crimp, you only have to do this once. At least on the first set or first round of prepping that brass, you only need to do this once in regards to removing the crimp. Once you do this, you don't have to do it again, which is nice. In regards to uniforming the primer pocket, you usually only need to do this once, but this is a helpful tool for cleaning out the primer pocket itself. So a lot of times I'll still just run this on the uniformer, not so much to uniform the primer pocket, but just to clean it out to get a nice clean primer pocket. It does a good job at doing that. So I usually will run that every single time during the reloading process. As for chamfering the outside and inside of the case mouth openings, if your brass is trimmed with a harsh cut, you absolutely need to do this. It's absolutely crucial. But if you do not trim the brass, especially if you use something like a stainless steel wet tumbler, stainless steel wet tumblers with those little pins or stainless steel shavings, if it's not trimmed, can peen the case mouth opening. When I say peening, those little pins or shavings can put little micro dents in the case mouth opening perimeter. Whether or not that affects accuracy, I guess I'll leave that up to you. But sometimes it definitely doesn't hurt to lightly run it on the outside and inside if you don't trim the brass, just to make sure you got a uniform chamfer when it comes to seating that bullet. And obviously, always run it on the brush. All right, so we got our small rifle primers for 223 or 5.56 ammunition. I also have on my left here, this is the small pickup primer tube. On the right, obviously with the little bit bigger hole diameter, is the large rifle primer pickup tube. And also my small on the left and large rifle primer drop tubes here. So here is the primer flip tray, and it's got some raised ridges here. I'm gonna get my small rifle primers, put my primer flip tray like so, flip it upside down, get them all orientated in one direction. That's where obviously it gets his name, primer flip tray. Just like that, all in one direction. I'm gonna grab my small rifle primer pickup tube, pick all these up. And just like that, all 100. Now, I personally use the Hornady lock and load progressive press for seating primers. I have the small rifle primer seater installed along with the small rifle primer shuttle. And then I'm going to take my small rifle primer drop tube, install that here. And it's very important to make sure that you got the correct end installed. I almost got it upside down. And I just like to use a little bit of blue painter's tape to hold this on. And then I take my primer flip tube here, flip it upside down, and there's a little cotter pin here. I just pull on that. Before I do that, there is one primer still stuck in there. So I take my white weight rod, I push that primer home, and you'll watch this drop down the tube, just like that. All right, so I'm going to cycle this to make sure that the primers are feeding through the shuttle, and just like that, we got one primer. All right, so first and foremost, make sure you are wearing your safety glasses. I've heard of horror stories where one primer ignites and it ignites off the entire tube. Trust me, you're not going to have a good day if you're not wearing safety glasses. What I like to do, at least with the Hornady lock and load progressive press here, is I come home, I feel the resistance of that primer being inserted into that snug primer pocket. As a side note, for those that are absolutely new, as you reload this brass through its second, third, fourth, fifth, maybe around your fifth or sixth firing on that brass, especially for a semi-automatic, which is a little bit more hard on that brass, you'll notice as you're inserting that primer, you cannot feel any resistance whatsoever through the press handle. It's a clear indication that your primer pockets are becoming loose and that you have met the life expectancy of that brass, and that brass simply needs to be thrown away. So as you're inserting that primer, you feel that resistance through the press handle. And what I like to do is just quick inspect it, make sure that the primer is seating just below flush. And just a quick show you here that this is just below flush, not at flush, and definitely not sticking out. If this primer is sticking out, you can get what's called a slam fire, especially in a semi-automatic where you don't have control over the bolt. And that comes home onto that primer, and if it's not sitting just below flush and is actually sticking out, you can get what's called a slam fire, where the bolt face will ignite the primer before the casing is inserted into the chamber, and this will go boom. Trust me, you will not have a good day. I like to do what's called a tabletop test. If it sits down on a tabletop fast and flat, doesn't wobble at all, clear indication that that primer is seated just below flush, it's not sticking out. And that's where I inspect it. Everything looks good. And I transfer this over to my epintegrations lockdown reloading block and move on to the next piece. Nice tension. I inspect it. Sits flat, flat, and fast. And move this on to my reloading tray. And just like that, 100 casings ready to drop powder. It's definitely a beautiful thing. And that's it. We are ready for dropping powder. And that's why I really like these epintegrations lockdown reloading blocks. They're completely adjustable, and you can either really lock this down home tight and you'll have little to no wobble at all in these casings, or if you want, you can feather this off ever so slightly if you want a little bit more room for adding and removing those casings in and out of the reloading tray. Being that I am ready to drop powder, I personally like to lock these home nice and tight. So I'm just going to lock both of these down. As you can see, they slide right together. Well, that is the end of this part of the series. Done with brass prep hell and seating primers. We are finally up to the point of dropping powder, which I'm going to do with the FX120i and some Barget powder. We're going to seat some 60 grain Hornady VMAX bullets. I will see you guys in the next part of this series.